I would like to complete our discussion of the Old Testament texts and textual criticism by dealing with the area of textual criticism. Broadly speaking, there are two types of textual errors that could be made. One textual error would be accidental errors, and the other category of textual errors would be intentional errors. Under the category of accidental errors would be places where the scribe unintentionally made a mistake. One type of such error is didography. That's when you write a word or letter twice, when you should have only written it once. Or you might omit words or letters. Or you might miswrite a word or letter. You just misspelled it. Or you write a word's homonym, a word that sounds like it, rather than the word itself. Or you write a synonym, what the word means, rather than the word itself. All of those are unintentional errors that scribes can introduce. But then there's another category you might call intentional errors. That's where the scribe has intentionally changed the text and thereby brought a mistake into the tradition. One way this could happen is the scribe is reading the text, he thinks he sees something wrong with it, and so he fixes it, even though the text is correct. And so correcting a perceived error can be a form of introducing textual variations or textual errors into the tradition. Or perhaps he even looks at the text and thinks that he can do better than what's written there, and he tries to improve on it. At that point, the scribe becomes an author or an editor rather than just a copyist. So how do we go about doing textual criticism? First rule, understand that the Masoretic text is the best tradition. That's the consensus of Old Testament text critical scholars, that the Masoretic text is, among all the traditions and versions that are out there, is the best. And so generally it's going to be given some degree of priority just for that reason. But that doesn't mean that the Masoretic text is infallible. When should we correct the Masoretic text? And the answer is as follows. One is if the Masoretic text makes no sense, well, that could be an indication that the Masoretic text is corrupt. Now, this is going to be a little different than with New Testament textual criticism, where you would never make a conjecture. But with the Old Testament text, sometimes conjecture is all you have in order to fix a problem. So if the Old Testament text makes no sense as it stands, you might suspect that it has some sort of error in it, that is corrupt. Second, where several texts and versions agree against it. So maybe some Hebrew manuscripts agree against it. Some of the Septuagint or the Syriac or other versions agree against it, or the Samaritan agrees against it. Well, under those cases where several texts and versions agree against a Masoretic reading, that's a strong indication that perhaps the Masoretic reading is wrong. Or where a non-Masoretic reading best explains the variations that are in the other manuscripts. Well, that could be an indication that the Masoretic text needs correction. Now, some of the rules for New Testament textual criticism don't seem to apply as well for the Old Testament. So if you were doing New Testament textual criticism, they would tell you that the shorter reading is to be preserved on the assumption that the scribe is likely to add stuff. And that's not a bad rule for New Testament manuscript tradition, but most variations in the Old Testament happen to be of the same length. Another rule that doesn't seem to apply is in the New Testament manuscripts, you would say the more difficult reading is to be preferred, which assumes that scribes tended to want to clarify the text. But in the Masoretic tradition, the only way that we may know that there's a problem is if the text is difficult, if it's problematic, doesn't make sense. Another rule of New Testament textual criticism that doesn't seem to apply to the Old Testament is the rule to avoid conjectural emendation. Now that rule applies very well to New Testament textual criticism because with the New Testament we have so many manuscripts and attestations of the text that one or another of the texts and versions of the New Testament are going to have virtually every possible textual variation reading. But with the Old Testament, things are not nearly so richly attested. Now, sometimes problems reflect our ignorance of the meanings of rare words rather than being a genuine textual corruption. So we should be reluctant to make conjectural emendation. It's far better if we have a actual text that has the variation that we wanting to adopt over and above the Masoretic tradition. But on the other hand, the earliest corruptions in the Hebrew text may have occurred before any attested texts that we now have existed, and therefore be in all the traditions. So that rule does not universally apply. Let me close with one example of a text that where you can do some textual criticism. It's kind of a trivial example because our decision doesn't really change the meaning of the text, which is true in most text critical issues as it turns out. But it's in Ruth chapter 1 and verse 1, which in the Masoretic tradition reads, "In the days of the judging of the judges." You can see the Hebrew there if you happen to read Hebrew. The Septuagint reflects a shorter reading that omits the word days, when the judges judged. And again, if you read the Greek, you can see the infinitive form of judging and the word for judges, ente krinein tus krites. And basically it's taking the first word days, which is down here in the Hebrew text, and omits it in the Septuagint version. If you go to the Syriac version, it reads, "in the days of the judges." And it seems to omit the infinitive construct form in Hebrew, translated here judging, in its text that it was translating. So it reads, "in the days of the judges." Again, leaving out that infinitive construct form. So which reading is the original reading? And the way that you might go about doing that is to try to come up with the reading that best explains the others. So let's assume that the Septuagint reading is the correct reading. Well, then the Masoretic tradition would have to have added the word days into the text, which did not originally exist. Whereas the Syriac version would have had to delete the word judging, or the infinitive construct form, in the version that it was translating. And that would be two different changes in two different directions. Same thing if you assume that the Syriac reading is the correct reading in the days of the judges. The Septuagint would have had to have omitted the word days, and the Masoretic tradition would have had to add the word judging in the mix. Whereas if you assume that the Masoretic text is the original reading, well then it could have been corrupted by being simplified by the Septuagint by dropping the word days inadvertently, accidental error in the when the judges judge. Or the Syriac may have either deleted the word judging, the infinitive construct form, judging, or may have just paraphrased a bit and just said in the days of the judges to simplify. Either case, it looks to me like the Masoretic text is probably the original reading. It's the one that most easily explains the variation of the other two, in which the Septuagint dropped the word days, and the Syriac either simplified or dropped that infinitive form, judging. That ends our discussion of the texts of the Old Testament and textual criticism.